just want to thank you guys again for joining us. This has been part of our COVID-19 action initiative with the faculty of Columbia School of Social Work, mobilizing and partnering with different experts from other institutions and within the field, all with the goal of monitoring developments and disseminating information that can be helpful to social workers, our interdisciplinary colleagues, and the clients that we serve. For today's webinar, we've been really excited and fortunate to be able to work with Carrie Epstein and Stephen Marins from the Yale Child Study at the Yale School of Medicine. So thank you guys so much for joining us and being present today. And with that, I want to turn the mics over to you guys.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tiffany. And I know I'm speaking on behalf of myself and Stephen Marins. We really want to thank you all for putting this together. We're very glad to be here this morning with everyone. Welcome to everyone across the country and across the world, it sounds like. So welcome and thank you. And again, so I'm Carrie Epstein. I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Stephen Marins from the Yale Child Study Center at the Yale School of Medicine. And we'd really like to welcome you all to this training focused on how to support hospital staff who are experiencing COVID-19 related stress. And while many of you may not be called on to provide consultation for impacted hospital staff at this juncture, hopefully this training will inform you about some of the best practices in dealing with the presentation of acute distress and prepare you should there be a resurgence of greater need in later phases of the pandemic and in fact, in general in your future practice. And while this training was really for the specific purposes of equipping mental health professionals to be of assistance to hospital staff, it may also be useful in your response to other adults who are seeking care in response to their COVID-19 related stress reactions and beyond. So this training will run from 9:30 to 12:30 here on the East Coast, so for the next 3 hours. I realize we're covering different time zones. And we'll be taking 2 5-minute breaks during the training, generally around at the top of the hour. You've received some handouts from us, and again, I think that they'll also be posted in case there's anything that you're not able to find or open. One is a PDF file of our PowerPoint slides for participants to have. In addition, there should be a PDF fillable file of the Acute Stress Disorder Scale, which is an evidence-based assessment instrument that we'll review during the training. And also for your use during the actual one-on-one consultation sessions that you'll be providing. Finally, and we'll make sure you get this, you'll be receiving, if you haven't yet, a link to a document called Understanding and Coping with Stress Reactions During the Pandemic that we'll also reference during the training that you can use as a resource actually during your one-on-one consultations as well. And then finally, you've got 2 outlines of the acute stress intervention that we'll be teaching about today. One is a brief outline, one is a longer outline. These are just meant to be things that one can follow to help you feel grounded as you implement this approach. And then I think just to reiterate what Tiffany sort of referenced earlier, in terms of gathering questions, Stephen and I plan to pause at the end of each training component to respond to questions that people are putting forward through the chat box and the Q&A box, and to connect with you at that time. And we'll also take at that time a 5-minute break. We'll keep it really to 5 minutes because we have a lot of material to get through, but we will be taking a 5-minute break at that time as well. So next slide, please. Could we go to the next slide? Thank you. So really what we're going to be covering here in this training is really a review of what is known about the impact of high levels of distress generated by ongoing external dangers and demands, as well as the benefits of a structured approach to one-on-one consultation. And then we're going to walk through with you the steps to that one-on-one consultation that's referred to as the Acute Stress Intervention, or ASI, and of course we'll be covering questions. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Stephen Marins.
So welcome, everyone. I think it's always true when we're doing clinical work that as we're listening to the folks we're trying to help, that a great deal is naturally stirred up in ourselves. But in the current situation, it's important to remember and acknowledge that the events that are impacting the people who may be contacting us are impacting us as well. And this is a very important thing to consider, especially when external dangers are threatening so many and arouse so much. So many of you may have a great deal or a range of experience in working with adults in a range of settings, as well as with a variety of psychotherapeutic approaches. And some of you may even have some experience doing trauma-focused work. However, it's not surprising if many of you have had more limited experience in responding clinically to people who are struggling with acute stress reactions to external threats and the accompanying disruption of normal, predictable routines of daily life that so many of us have been experiencing. Next slide. So many hospital staff are very used to being busy, but in the midst of the pandemic and responding to a range of challenges is above and beyond what even the most experienced hospital staff may be used to. The current experience is quite different now. Many have been caring for very high numbers of seriously ill patients. They're experiencing the loss of many more patients than they've experienced in the past. And this is also accompanied by the burden of needing to stand in for family members who can't be there to support their patients while they're ill or be by their side in the last moments of their lives. On top of these enormous weights, all of the staff who are working in the hospital carry the additional burden of their own understandable concerns about risk of infection for themselves and their loved ones. Next slide. Under these circumstances, it's not surprising that normally available strategies for coping with stress might be severely challenged, if not wholly undermined. We know that when the ability to regulate the interplay between thoughts, somatic experience, mood, and behaviors is significantly disrupted, affected individuals can feel as out of control of themselves as they do with regard to the world around them. Next slide. The aim of the intervention we'll be teaching today is to help individuals recognize and learn new approaches to coping with overwhelming stress reactions and to reassert order and control in the midst of real-world circumstances over which control has not yet been achieved. While it's heartening to see the number of hospital admissions go down in many communities around the country and that fewer ICU beds may be filled at this point, we're aware that we're not so clear about what the future holds, and the current demands for those who are working with patients who are in the hospital are still great. We're not through this yet. And we don't know what the future is going to hold. And so for that reason, our goal is to present you all with a model that will be helpful now, as well as later if needed. Carrie? Hello?
I'm so sorry, I'm muted. Can you go to the next slide? Oh, I'm sorry, go back one. Thank you. So as we begin to walk through the components of this intervention, in order to best hear and best help the people with whom we're consulting, some of the most important themes to keep in mind are ones that really have to do with ourselves. So none of these are really necessarily going to be new to you because they're really themes that are involved in all of our psychotherapeutic interventions. So they're all the more important to focus on when external events that may precipitate someone seeking help are the ones that are affecting all of us in different ways. So we want to slow down long enough to increase your awareness of your own responses. How do you keep doing what you're doing? But also, what are your reactions? How do your reactions impact the work? So we want to separate our own responses from what we're hearing about the experience of others, and really being aware of when you're anxious about what you anticipate hearing from the people you're hoping to help. Next slide, please. Okay, can you go to the next slide? I think we're off. Okay, can you go to the next slide? Perfect. So we want to review with you about what's known about the impact of high levels of distress that can be generated by ongoing dangers and demands. And so we really want to focus on the fact that when so much of our current external world is out of control, it's especially important to find ways to increase the level of control that we can have over responses to the danger and fear that we may be experiencing. And one of the best ways to begin to take greater control of our own distress and anxiety, and to help those that we're working with, that we care about, is to learn to recognize and understand what is actually occurring in our minds and bodies when we're highly stressed or afraid. And so when we can observe and understand our own versions of the shared human experience of fear and uncertainty, we are better able to make choices that can turn down the volume of our distress and increase our feelings of well-being. If you can take us to the next slide, and I'll turn it over to Stephen.
So as Carrie's talking about, the fear with which, unfortunately, we are all familiar, it's important to pause for a moment and remember the fact that some of the threats and demands that are created by COVID-19 actually apply to all of us. And it's important to remember that the context of acute stress reactions actually occur when some of the common human sources, shared sources of human fear, are right in front of us. And these occur especially when the external world is threatening. It's important to keep in mind the context for which, in which we may be experiencing higher levels of distress. We know that as human beings, we all share these common dangers, and they include loss of life, of self and others, loss of love of ourselves and of others, damage to our bodies, loss of control of thoughts, affects, and behavior when we feel we're losing it, loss of a predictable world that we take for granted as a basis for what we do in daily life. And that these kinds of themes of common human fears are especially pronounced when there's a convergence with external dangers and threats. So now imagine, next slide, if we think about how some of these common themes may be confronted by healthcare staff who are involved in the care of patients with COVID-19. So if we think about those basic sources of fear and think about how they may converge for our colleagues in the hospital, then we may be able to better appreciate the extent to which the current burdens may make folks more vulnerable to high levels of distress. For example, the fear about their own vulnerability and risk of infection, both for themselves and family members. Or think about the high volume of very ill COVID-19 patients with whom they're working that may require intensive and exhausting assessment, acute response, and ongoing care. Imagine the frustration and feelings of helplessness that from the reality of our current limited knowledge about effective treatments, the need for PPE, et cetera, confront hospital staff every time they're engaged with seriously ill patients. Think about the frustration about the barriers that are necessary in terms of safety in providing care for patients. The kind of protective barriers that also interfere with the typical full range of interactions and connection with the patient as a result of the need for PPE. And think about the confrontation with the experience of someone else's loss when you as the hospital staff member is the only one who can be close by when a patient is dying in the absence of family members and friends. And then think about the high volume of confrontation with death that some hospital staff are dealing with, in addition to the high volume for some of having to inform families of the death of a loved one. This can not only be painful, as we imagine what that experience might be like if it were our family member or our family or a member of our family, but also can increase the sense of defeat, particularly in the context of professional aspirations that so many share in the direction of saving lives, helping others. And then for some, the sheer volume of experiencing the issuing of death notifications. Next. So we know that when there is this convergence of shared human fears with external, the reality of external threats to safety and control, there can be a significant impact on the way our minds and our bodies actually function. And so one of the things we want to talk about briefly is what are the impacts of high level of stressful circumstances on brain functioning. And the reason for doing this is to actually provide a common frame of reference for us to understand and be clear about what's happening for people who are impacted by high levels of distress. So let's get specific about what that impact might be. So under normal circumstances, there's a regular and constant communication between two important parts of our brain, the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, often called being responsible for the chemistry of our emotions. And the prefrontal cortex helps us to organize information. It's responsible for executive functioning. That helps us actually make decisions about the actions we take in response to external and internal challenges. And the amygdala is the emotional center of the brain, plays a central role in responding to fear and threat by triggering the fight-flight response. Communication between these two parts of our brain allows us to find ways of turning the volume down in times of stress. And on a pleasant side, imagine getting ready for a vacation. You're really excited about taking a break, maybe going someplace new or returning to someplace that you know is going to be just great fun and source of relaxation. And imagine, getting ready for that trip and feeling like you're running around, and as excited as you are, you're feeling stressed by all the things you need to do. And then think about what are some of the ways that we turn to in order to turn the volume of that stress down. And one of those ways is making a list. And again, by making a list, we're able to find order, especially as we check off the things that we need to do in order to get ready. This is an example of an interaction between two parts of our brain where by making a list, we're shoring up the executive functioning of our prefrontal cortex, and in turn, turning the volume down on the stress response, the chemistry of stress response in the amygdala. Next. when we're confronted by external threats to our own safety and the safety of others, when there are major disruptions to the ways we live, the communication between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala can be significantly disrupted. We may say at these times our brains may literally not be able to work in the same way. And the increased production of stress hormones, which is part of the activation of our fight-flight responses, can lead to symptoms of anxiety and distress that we experience in our bodies as well as in our minds. When our stress level is particularly high, we not only experience higher levels of physical symptoms, but our ability to use thinking as a way to calm ourselves and take control may also not work as well. And as you know, in the best of times, the signal function of anxiety spurs us to take protective action. We also know that our defensive responses may lead to symptoms that bring a high cost of their own. For example, obsessive compulsive defenses against constant internal conflictual sources of anxiety can lead to significant impairments in general function and well-being. But in response to ongoing real external threats, the amygdala may be working overtime, and the prefrontal cortex, which organizes thoughts, analyzes problems, and initiate action plans, can be overwhelmed. When this occurs, we can experience very real changes in our ways of thinking, and changes in physical and cognitive symptoms can further activate our alarm systems, creating a vicious cycle that magnifies our sense of loss of control and helplessness. Not only at these times, not only is the world around us out of control, but our own reactions and feelings seem to be out of control as well. Next. This is just a very graphic description or a slide that gives us a look at the connections between the parts of our brain. But I think we've covered that, and for further reference, you'll have these available. Next. So when there is this breakdown of the typical communication that helps us feel in greater control, both of our feelings and our thoughts, we actually have very real experiences in how we feel physically, in terms of our somatic responses of heart pounding, rapid breathing, sweating, gastrointestinal distress, headaches or muscle tension in the absence of illness. Next. In the cognitive arena, we may experience frequent difficulties concentrating. We may have intrusive thoughts and images. We may have nightmares. We may have an increased degree of self-critical thoughts, including shame about behaviors or actions, about feeling weaker or less capable in and of itself. We may feel guilty about not being able to fulfill some of the goals and functions of our work in the way that we ordinarily might have greater levels of success. And in extreme situations, some may be more prone to suicidal thoughts and ideation. And just to make a note about the obvious, when that occurs, we want to move very rapidly to a much fuller evaluation in order to ensure safety and make a determination about the degree and extent of required care in order for someone to recover from this particular very severe reaction. Next. In the area of affective experience, how we feel, we can also experience a tremendous impact, including persistent sadness. Again, there's a difference between having moments of sadness and having persistent sadness, or persistent sense of uselessness or ineffectiveness, or persistent anger, where this is a dominating experience of mood. And we're saying persistent because it makes sense that a person may be feeling sad or angry in response to what they're experiencing in their work life or outside of their work life. But if these feelings are persistent, it may be a marker of the severity, the impact of high levels of distress. You may see a loss of interest in the things that that the individual or we ourselves have previously enjoyed, or feeling distant or emotionally cut off from oneself or from others, not just temporarily, but as a new normal, or feeling increased irritability or lack of patience. Again, we're talking about the persistent and consistent experience of this element of changes in our mood. Or we may have persistent preoccupying fear, and this is especially hard when the confrontation with sources of fear are much more prominent. Next. All of these changes in how we feel in our bodies, how we think, and in our moods also lead to behavioral changes. We may have trouble falling or staying asleep or sleeping too much whenever we can. Being easily startled, being super alert or watchful or on guard, constantly feeling like you're looking over your shoulder for dangers that may be lurking. We may withdraw from contact with others. We may have irritable and increased in irritable interactions or angry outbursts with others. And we may find ourselves repetitively checking the news. And this is not an uncommon experience that in many ways we turn to information as a way of trying to increase our mastery, our ability to metabolize unwanted reality. The problem is that the repetitive and often compulsive checking of the news doesn't serve our mastery, but rather evokes and arouses a level of activation that perpetuates this cycle of dysregulation between executive functioning, our ability to think in organized ways, and the chemistry of our emotions that are so readily activated. We also may get stuck with increased obsessional thinking and compulsive actions as well. Carrie, next.
Thank you. You could, perfect. So as Stephen was just describing about the impact of high levels of stress that it can have on the brain and body functioning, we'd like to talk a bit now about the benefit of a structured approach when you're working with someone who has been impacted by very distressing events, or someone who has experienced high levels of distress that may be generated by ongoing external dangers and demands. So when our minds and bodies are dysregulated, the capacity for ordering and integrating is diminished. And it's at these times when our executive functioning is compromised that our interventions need to be aimed at helping an individual to restore order that can lead to an increased capacity for self-observation, an increased sense of structure, predictability, and control. So how do we use this to inform our conversations? Well, first, we want to really slow the conversations down. And second, really hold structured discussions. So in the midst of the personal experience of loss of control, our intervention really needs to deliver a level of structure, predictability, and opportunity for control that is currently less available to the individual that we're working with. The next slide. By grounding the consultation session in a conceptual frame of reference based on what we know about the impact of high levels of distress on thinking, feeling, acting, as well as the physical and somatic reactions, we're able to first offer information that can help the individual better recognize and understand their own personal versions of the cycle of stress reactions. The resulting increased capacity for self-observation can play a critical role in achieving a greater sense of control. Second, we're able to help individuals observe and describe their experience of stress reactions. So by using a direct and structured approach, we can really help them substitute less informative, broad descriptors, such as I'm feeling anxious, nervous, afraid, stressed, with words that can more clearly articulate the details of their experiences. Next slide, please. So now we're going to move into reviewing the structured approach of one-on-one consultation, the acute stress intervention. So next slide. If we can go to the next slide. Thank you. Prior to the consultation appointment, ideally, the individual should have an opportunity to review the document that we've sent out to you or that will be sent out to you called Understanding and Coping with Reactions During the Pandemic. So in addition, it would be ideal if they have a copy of the document with them during the appointment, because this can really act, it can become a touchstone for the consultation session. Now we want to talk a little bit about the length of each session. The intended length of each session is meant to be around 50 minutes. So in scheduling appointments, it can be really helpful and important to help individuals carve out the time. That will be a very important first step in helping them to find better ways to take care of themselves and to reduce stress. So for that reason, it's very important to schedule these appointments at times that can ensure that the individual is best able to make time for themselves, is not distracted by work and family responsibilities, if that is at all possible. Next slide. This slide and the one that follows is a brief summary of the acute stress intervention, or ASI. You should have received a copy of a document with a brief outline of this prior to the training, and you can use that as a guide for conducting ASI, as I mentioned earlier. So I'm going to just quickly walk you through it, and it actually is going to predict what we're going to be going over today. So first, we're going to talk about opening the session and checking in, providing some brief psychoeducation on the impact of high levels of stress with the person that you're talking to. And then you're going to introduce and administer a brief assessment instrument called the Acute Stress Disorder Scale that we'll be going over together. And based on what you learn from that assessment, the next steps will be focusing in on symptoms that were endorsed in the Acute Stress Disorder Scale that were the most frequent or impacting the person the most problematic. And then you're going to introduce specific coping strategies that would specifically decrease those problematic symptoms or reactions. You'll move into discussing daily life routines with every individual that you're working with, since that has such an impact on them. And then, if sleep issues were endorsed, you're going to talk about the basics of sleep hygiene. After that, you're going to move into coping strategies, and you're going to focus again on symptoms that were endorsed in the Acute Stress Disorder Scale that are most frequent, most impacting the individual, and again, introducing coping strategies that are the best response to those problematic symptoms. Next slide, please. Then you'll be introducing those coping strategies to bring symptoms down and decrease those symptoms. And although we have several coping strategies that we're going to be going over with you today and that are listed on the outline, we really want to stress that you're not going to be trying to cover all of these coping strategies in one session. You'll be really first focusing in on the most problematic symptoms that were endorsed in the Acute Stress Disorder Scale, and then introducing and reviewing coping strategies that are the best match for the symptoms you've identified that you will specifically work on decreasing. Again, the symptoms that are most impactful and most frequent. The example coping strategies that we're going to be reviewing today include focused breathing, which can be particularly helpful for the physical symptoms, for example, heart pounding, muscle tension, stomach aches, also helpful for a lot of the emotional symptoms that come up. We're going to be going over guided imagery, which can be particularly helpful for when someone is struggling with intrusive thoughts or repetitive disturbing thoughts and images and worries. We're going to be going over challenging and helpful thoughts, self-critical thoughts, thinking too far ahead, imagining worst kinds of thoughts. Progressive muscle relaxation is something else we'll go over, as well as social connectedness and helpful considerations in regard to that. And finally, talking about arranging for and planning for the follow-up session. Next slide. So now, as you open up the one-on-one consultation session of the acute stress intervention, you'll start by introducing yourself, and you really open up the session by outlining what the structure of the session will be. Really, this is about predictability for the person you're working with. And again, that creates a sense of control. So for example, the session will be an opportunity to talk about and review their current situation, their areas of difficulty. Why are they contacting you now? Why are you speaking with them? And in addition, the session will be an opportunity to review what we know about the range of experiences that we all can have in highly distressing situations in order to increase the individual's ability to observe what's happening to them as the first step to finding ways of turning down the volume and feeling greater control by recognizing the components of distress rather than being overwhelmed by an undefined wave. Next slide, please. So this slide is really presenting some sample language that you could use. Again, you can actually speak to this in whatever way is comfortable for you. But in case it would be helpful, we've given some sample language. So for example, we might be opening the session by saying, I'd very much like to hear what's happening for you generally. And we'll also review together some of the details specifically about functioning, about thoughts, feelings, somatic reactions, and behaviors. And we'll discuss some of the strategies and approaches to turning the volume down. And toward the end of the call, we'll think together about what further contact and help might be useful. Next slide, please. So after opening the session, I'm going to briefly ask and explore with the individual how they're doing in general and what their greatest areas of difficulty are, the areas of greatest difficulty. So again, on this slide, we gave you some sample language just to take a look at. For example, I want to hear about how you're doing and hear about the areas that are hard. I'd also like to share with you what we know about stress reactions. So first, tell me what's going on for you, what you're looking into in terms of areas of greatest difficulty. The next slide. At this point in the consultation session, you'll move into providing some brief psychoeducation. Having a better understanding of what's happening in our minds and bodies when we're experiencing high levels of stress can really provide individuals with a basis for considering what to do to bring reactions under greater control. And again, here we're giving you some sample introductory language that you can take a look at. So here it says, so let me tell you about what we know about stress reactions. So we have a context for thinking together about your current experience. The more we can understand what happens to us as human beings, the better we're able to observe in detail what is happening to ourselves as individuals. So here's what we know about stress reactions. So it's also important to note that we can be explicit with a person about why we're doing what we're doing. In fact, that actually makes the work even stronger. So even before going into psychoeducation, we want to tell the person about why we're talking about this. So for example, saying something like, now I'm going to tell you about what we know so we can have some grounding and a better understanding of what we know. Next slide, please. So the psychoeducation that we're talking about now, that you'll be doing with the individual, is based on the material that Stephen walked through earlier about the phenomena of stress reactions. So this slide and the two additional slides that follow really include sample bullet points that you might want to consider including in the psychoeducation you're doing with the individual. So these slides can really be seen as basic talking points that you can draw on to develop language that feels most comfortable to you in describing the phenomena of stress reactions. So the slide we're looking at here really talks about the regular communication between the two important parts of our brain, that prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, and the role of each of these parts of our brain. Next slide. This next slide really summarizes and talks about what happens when communication between those two parts of the brain, the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, is disrupted. When we feel threatened by threats to our own safety and the safety of others, major disruptions to the way we live, or loss of love of others or ourselves. Next slide. And this slide really reviews what happens when our stress levels are particularly high, when our amygdala is working in overdrive and our prefrontal cortex is offline. So to speak, about the fact that when our stress level is particularly high, we're not only experiencing higher levels of physical symptoms, but our ability to use thinking as a way to calm ourselves and take control may also not work as well. So we want to remember that what we've just reviewed is some basic information you can use. You can use it as an outline, but we want to be clear that you can use your own language to describe the phenomena in whatever language you'd like, in ways that you think would be most helpful to the individual. In terms of a shared frame of reference, looking at this slide in particular, we're almost anticipating the self-observing capacity. It's also a jumping off point in terms of our heading toward introducing coping strategies. And it's also important to note that we can be explicit with the person about why we're doing what we're doing. So even before getting to that psychoeducation, we want to tell them why we're talking about this. So this note of the notion of being explicit is an important ingredient. We all know this experience when we're feeling overwhelmed. We don't always have the capacity to know what's happening for us. So our goal is to equip the person to look more closely with some help to identify the details of what is happening for them. We're addressing predictability and helping people take advantage of new tools to help take greater control. Next slide. So now we're going to talk about the individual's experience in greater detail. At this point in the consultation session, you're going to use a structured assessment tool within the session, the Acute Stress Disorder Scale, or the ASDS, to really hone in on the individual's specific stress symptoms. Now, there's several reasons for walking through the symptom scale, a possible cluster of symptoms with the individual. By walking through the symptom and reaction questions, you're helping the person define words and clearly identify the details of what they initially described as an experience of being perhaps upset or worried or afraid. So this is the first step of helping the individual person in the following ways. It helps to increase their self-observing capacity with regard to their own reactions. And this helps in turn support reestablishing a process of ordering our thinking that is really undermined when executive functioning is being repeatedly compromised by the biology of our fight and flight stress responses. So this allows for identification, targeting of specific areas of functioning, so thoughts, emotions, somatic expression behaviors that might benefit from use of coping strategies. So again, next in the session, you'll be walking through the questions, the acute stress disorder scale with the individual. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to really introduce the acute stress disorder scale to you, and this has been sent out as a handout, and I'll show you an example of what it looks like in the next slide. But this is really, the acute stress disorder scale is a brief 20-item evidence-based assessment tool of common symptoms seen in individuals who are experiencing high levels of distress, and it's consistent with DSM criteria for acute stress disorder. This version of the acute stress disorder scale was really adapted for COVID-19 by our colleague, Dr. Nancy Cassim-Adams, and her team at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, CHOP. So we're going to briefly review this for a second. This is a tool that is made up of 20 questions, and there is a Likert scale so that when you ask a question of the individual, they'll let you know whether they're experiencing that particular reaction or symptom. 1, not at all. 2, mildly. 3, medium. 4, quite a bit. And 5, very much. So in terms of scoring the acute stress disorder scale, you'll note that significant reactions, when you add up the total, the significant reactions are defined in the following ways. If the score of questions 1 through 19 is greater than or equal to 56, then you're thinking that the person is having a significant level of reaction. Or if you just look at question 20, which is asking how much these reactions are getting in the way of their work, their relationships, and other part of their life, you take a look at that score. And if that question is rated at greater than or equal to 3, then again, you're thinking about significant levels of symptoms. Again, we're not actually trying to say you'd be ruling anyone out. It just gives you a context for how they're doing. Next slide, please. So this is a copy of the Acute Stress Disorder Scale. So you can see it. If you can go to the next slide. Okay, so next you're going to actually introduce the Acute Stress Disorder Scale to the individual in session. And on this slide, really, again, is some sample language, how you might think about introducing the scale. So sample language might be, so now we're going to talk about your experience in greater detail and walk through a list of some specific symptoms or difficulties that are common ways in which we experience the impact of high levels of stress. And if you want to think about some helpful hints about how to administer this scale, you may want to consider getting a copy of this, the blank scale, to someone so that they can read along with you. We're not suggesting that they fill it out in advance. This is something that you actually want to do as part of the clinical work. And as you go through it with them, you're going to read the questions out loud and just have them answer them one by one. So in introducing the scale, this is a great opportunity to explain why you're doing what you're doing. So being able to say that the reason we're doing this scale, that it's often hard for people to put their experience, their symptomatic experience is what we mean, into words. And we want to do this to help people mobilize to be able to turn down their distress. Next slide. And I'm going to pause for a minute. People wanted to go back to see the slide, it looks like, of the scale. Just go back to it for a moment so you can see it. This was actually sent out to you. I think one more slide back, you'll see the scale itself. So you can see the Likert scale at the top, and then a list of 20 questions, and then the way you score it right at the bottom. That's the full scale. Okay. All right, so if you can go back to the slide that says great and perfect. So when you've completed the scale, the acute stress disorder scale with the individual, you really want to notice the following. Are there symptoms that really cluster together? You know, for example, they might be having intrusive thoughts, but you may be identifying that they may be having intrusive thoughts and it's impacting their sleep. So do symptoms cluster together? And are there symptoms that are happening there particularly frequently? So what are the different broad areas of functioning that are most impacted by the symptoms? So you're thinking about, are they most impacting them when they're at work, when they're at home, when they're taking care of family members, when they're trying to sleep? Is it impacting relationships? And then later, you're going to move through the coping strategies to lower those symptoms, to focus in on symptoms that are most frequent or most impactful. So really, the goal here is to identify, let's say, 2 of the most frequent or impactful symptoms to focus on. And then as a next step, you'll be reviewing routines of daily life with all individuals. Since the experience of routines have been disrupted, interrupted is such a common contribution to heightened vulnerability to stress reactions. And then, if the individual has reported issues with sleep, you'll review sleep hygiene. After that, you're going to focus in on the symptoms that you've identified as being most frequent or most impactful, and introduce coping strategies that are best matched for those symptoms. So as part of the training, as I said before, we're going to be reviewing a few coping strategies that are often some of the most effective strategies for the common challenging symptoms. However, we really want to stress that you'll only be focusing on coping strategies that are the best match for those symptoms that are coming up for that individual. So again, the ASDS is really helpful to organize the process of helping people really turn the volume down. And it really helps organize the process. So using the scale really helps improve intervention outcome. The very nature and the ordering of the phenomena can really help an individual in understanding not only what, but also why they're experiencing what they're experiencing. So the structured approach really helps create an organizing factor and bring structure to it. If you've asked them, you know, how are you doing? They're very likely going to say that I'm anxious. We want to move from sort of amorphous to the specific. So this ASDS is a brief, structured, effective way of helping them do just that. Next slide, please. So having administered the ASDS, next you're going to introduce the ideas of strategies that can be helpful in decreasing reactions that have been endorsed. So for example, sample language here is, now I'd like to talk to you about some strategies that can be helpful in turning the volume down on some of the stress reactions that you've been describing. And the first place to start is an area that can have, you know, a significant broad impact on our vulnerability to some of the specific symptoms you've just been describing. And these are routines of daily life. And then if it's endorsed as a problem area, sleep. So I think we're going to pause now and check in with Tiffany and the chat box to hear whether questions are coming up that people would like to have addressed.
Yes. All right. So any of you guys who have questions, please put them in the Q&A box so that we can go ahead and track them. Again, we're going to do our best to get through all questions. And so being able to keep track of them in a Q&A box will be able to will help us do so. So one question that we did that came in a little bit ago was, what ways can you determine if seeking information, for example, news, social media, is a pro that increases mastery rather than a con perpetuating stress for the patient?
That's a great question. And I think that one of the basic ways of finding out is by asking someone, so that you hear from people who are actually checking the news, you know, every hour. And I had a recent experience of this, and I simply said to the person, I said, so how do you feel when you see the news? Does it, you know, we talked about the function and the goal, which is to get more information to feel better. And so in, you know, I'm giving you the shorthand version, but then the question was, so how does that work for you? Does it make you feel less anxious? Or do you notice that these are times where some of the physical activation, the feelings of the stress reactions are more prominent? And being able to then walk through why it is that repeatedly checking the news may be more activating than calming, then becomes the basis for making and discussing some possibilities of consciously limiting the exposure to media.
All right, thank you. And then we also have another question. Pretty much, we have Amy commenting, I'm curious about the interface between vicarious trauma and acute stress reaction. Can you speak to that a bit more?
Yeah, I think that it's something to really think about. You know, it was something that we were talking about earlier about how we really want to think as we're doing this work about, you know, this is something you're reaching out, you're working with an individual, and you may be actually impacted yourselves. I mean, I know that, for example, when we're doing disaster response work, especially if the event has occurred right in our back door, that we really need to slow down and pay attention to how this is impacting us as well as we're walking into the room to talk to and work with an individual. So I think that one of the things we want to be thinking about is how is everything that we're talking about today, our understanding about how very distressing experiences can impact how we think, what's going on in our bodies, and sort of paying attention to that, thinking about how everything we're talking about today can be impacting the individual who's actually in the helper role, and how we can use these very same ways of increasing our own self-observational capacity, what's going on for us, and to use tools to actually turn the volume down on our own distress experiences so that we can be actually on stronger ground to help individuals we're working with. Stephen, I wanted to know if you had anything to add to that.
Yeah, I just to underline what you were just saying, Carrie. I think that often, you know, what we mean when we're talking about traumatic experiences where there's been a profound dysregulation of our normal capacities to regulate how we feel, think, and act in response. And I do think that there are reality circumstances that understandably make all of us more anxious. The issue isn't the presence or absence of not liking a certain situation or feeling more anxious about it. It's about how much anxiety are we experiencing. And our goal, and the goal of this intervention, and the goal for ourselves, isn't about ignoring or pushing away the fact that we may feel more vulnerable to being anxious, but it's about being able to achieve as much control as we possibly can, both for ourselves and, as Carrie has been describing, in the attempt of this intervention, is to increase the ability of someone to first even recognize what's going on with them, which can be enormously relieving, and also to achieve control by being better able to observe oneself, recognize the details of experience, which then provides a platform for thinking about what to do to, as Carrie's been saying, turn the volume down and achieve greater control.
All right, thank you so much. We have Tammy asking, how would you use this in a group format?
Tammy, it's an interesting thing to think about, and actually in the hospitals that we've been working with when we've been providing this training for folks who are really embedded in the hospitals, that has come up. And I think that the individual work, as you can imagine, can really hone in on an individual's really unique experiences. I think that one could really think about how you might take aspects of this and do it in a group format. It's a great opportunity to educate folks about the impact of stress on the way we think, what's going on in our bodies, how we feel, what's going on in terms of how we're acting, how we're behaving, and then to help people in a group sort of just reflect on, again, raising that self-observing capacity so they can be aware of what's going on for them, and actually talking about different coping strategies that can turn the volume down. So as you can imagine, I think what's nice about your question is that in a group format, one can actually imagine folks sort of talking about and brainstorming different coping strategies that they've used. I mean, again, I think that when an individual is really struggling, that one-on-one is really important, can be very useful, but sort of thinking about a complementary group kind of approach might be very useful.
And the only thing I add is that in the settings that we've been working, the distribution and with individuals, same thing, giving access to the coping and understanding reactions in a pandemic actually is an effort to increase the shared frame of reference. We're not in this alone. That everyone might be having a range of reactions to the external circumstances that we're all living through. And I think that it is not untypical for any of us as human beings that at the times when we're feeling shakiest are often the times where we have a tough time acknowledging our shakiness to ourselves, let alone to anyone else. Being able to share the reality that there are common experiences in response to external threats can often help support a decrease in the self-imposed isolation that we may all be vulnerable to when we're not feeling at our strongest.
Great, thank you. And then we also have another question coming in. I heard that freeze is a third stress response. Can you comment on the validity of this?
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful point that we always try to make so I'm delighted that someone raised it. Fight and flight are the descriptions of what we do in extreme circumstances to protect ourselves. And that the problem is that when the levels of our stress reactions are greatest, what actually occurs is that the fight or the flight response are immobilized. We feel stuck, we feel frozen. And in turn, that immobilization only enhances the sense of loss of control over ourselves in addition to the loss of control we feel about the circumstances that have aroused our reactions in the first place.
And Tiffany, I can see a couple of other questions that I could speak to.
Go for it, yeah.
So Kurt, there's a question from Kurt about it, that Kurt hasn't seen the acute stress disorder scale yet. Of course, people haven't maybe had the opportunity to review it yet. And the question was whether it's only COVID related or will it bring in other traumas that one may be experiencing. So one of the things that's really useful about the acute stress disorder scale is it's actually focusing in on acute stress symptoms, regardless of what the stressor is that's driving it. So you're actually, I think, going to find it very, very useful in working with anyone who is experiencing strong stress reactions. So when you take a look at it, you'll see that it isn't about what traumatic experience or potentially traumatic experience you've had or what stressful event you've had. It's more about what your reactions are to it. So it's actually, I think, going to be very useful in many different arenas for folks. The next question, Stephen, I'm just going to move on to another question. Is that okay with you?
Yep, that's fine.
Okay. The next question comes from Maria Morris, whether we could speak to how this intervention could be used with students who are experiencing a level of stress because their parents are healthcare providers. They're experiencing how level of distress, I think you mean low level of distress maybe, because their parents are healthcare providers. I think that the goal of this is not to necessarily anticipate or assume how someone's impacted. That's the real great part about using an assessment instrument as part of your clinical work. That you're actually going to go in, talk to folks about what could be happening, and use that assessment instrument to hone in on what is challenging for them. Whether the symptoms are low level, whether there's really just only one that's really impacting them. For example, they may have issues with sleep, and really gives you the opportunity to hone in on what the symptom or symptoms or symptom cluster is that's particularly troubling that individual, whether there's multiple symptoms that are happening, whether there's really strongly only one. So I think what we're going to do at this time, Stephen, I think we'll go to break. Does that sound okay with you?
Yeah, and at some point, let's return to the question that was just raised. And just very briefly, I do think that as we've used this intervention with folks, it's almost a second tier, which is the idea of distributing materials that can help inform the largest possible number of folks who are impacted by current circumstances. There's an opportunity to look at some of the resources available for turning the volume down. And at the point where the intervention is most indicated is when somebody's realizing that their efforts on their own, with or without the help of resources that are available, written online resources, that they're struggling more than feels comfortable. So I do think that being able to look to the resource that we've put out, that others have put out, can be enormously useful in helping people attend to themselves. This intervention is intended for those folks who are struggling more.
So thanks for all for your very thoughtful questions. We want to give people a 5-minute break here. We'll keep it really to 5 minutes because we have material to cover, and we want to get to as many questions as possible. So we will see you again in 5 minutes.
And during this time, you guys, we will stay logged on. So the webinar will keep going. Carrie and Stephen are just going to mute their mics or turn off their video temporarily. For anybody who's having, I think there's a few people who seem to be having trouble with the audio. In regards to that, we'd want you guys to be able to make sure that you're choosing the audio device that you are using. So you can, if you are still having problem, just take a moment and chat, type in the webinar chat box so that we could continue to support you and try to walk you through depending upon the device that you're on.
we ready?
Yes.
Oh, sorry about that. So one of the first places that we begin in terms of
Go to
reviewing.
the next slide as well, please. Sorry.
So one of the first places we can begin is talking about strategies for achieving greater control, is actually beginning by talking about the routines of daily life. And we talk about routines of daily life and the importance that they can have with any of the folks we're dealing with, regardless of the specific symptoms. And you know, when we're having big reactions, the structure of daily routines often goes by the wayside. And reviewing the routines of daily life is the first place to start, because they can have a significant impact more broadly in terms of the feelings of vulnerability we may all have to the specific symptoms that the individual may be endorsing. So lack of daily routines, both at work and at home, can be one of the major contributors. And because it's such a large contribution to the overall experience of vulnerability to dysregulation, it's a good place to start. So we can talk directly about this and talk about with the folks we're consulting with. We can talk about with them why this is a starting off point. That is, with the goal of finding some order, some degree of control by examining what's going on in daily life. So we begin by, you know, recognizing that, and we all know this, that routines are often hardest when we're feeling at our lowest. And it's a bit tricky because we know that at times of distress, it's hard to think about routines sometimes. And so we want to talk about the importance of routines in terms of the goal of reasserting order and control. Makes a lot of sense that things have been disrupted. But again, we're not trying to be prescriptive, but again, conveying in a very transparent, conversational way about why routines can play such an important role in recovering or turning the volume down on our stress reactions. Next slide. So again, what you're seeing is some sample language. You'll come up with language that feels most comfortable to you, but some of the examples that Carrie and I were using as suggestions are you're seeing in front of you. But for example, one of the first and most important strategies for decreasing stress reactions is to reassert order and predictability wherever we can in our routines of daily life. Or during difficult times, especially because of additional burdens and stress, it's not unusual that our typical patterns and routines that we rely on and take for granted, especially at home, have been disrupted. So first, let's talk about the specific ways in which your previous routines in daily life have been disrupted or changed. Next. And so when we think about this question about how routines have been disrupted, the person may talk about changes in their shift at work, for example, but it's important for us to ground the conversation. What we want to do is focus on what's going on for them. What are the specific ways in which their previous routines in daily life have been disrupted? So again, sample language might be one of the first ways of increasing a sense of control is to reestablish order and predictability. And at home might be before the COVID-19 pandemic, what would you typically do when you got home from a shift? What's typically happening now that's different? Or at work, in the midst of the many changes in work that you've had as a result of COVID-19, what specifically has changed? Are you able to ensure adequate breaks? And this is important. are you able to convey to colleagues when your levels of distress are at their highest? This goes back to the previous question that one of our participants today raised about the group, applying what we're talking about to the group. And the more that one's colleagues also have a shared frame of reference of typical, normal, but not nice responses to heightened levels of stress, the greater the ability it is for them to support each other when they're able to be direct and open about times that they're having the greatest difficulty. Next. We may, again, talk about the basic strategies and what it is that makes it difficult to reintroduce routines. And we're going to review some of the ways of taking control that have to do with the basics in the areas of after work routines and sleep. And it's also important to remember that, when we're talking about reestablishing routines or any of the strategies we're going to be talking about today, sometimes it's easier said than done. That when our bodies and minds are not cooperating with what may seem like common sense recommendations and ideas, the purpose of talking about this with folks is to, again, help them to better observe their own reactions as a basis for taking new steps in order to turn the volume down on the impact of their stress reactions. Next. So some of the ways to create a sense of routine during this time is, again, after establishing what's different between now and before the pandemic, it's also important to talk to the person about how some of those previous patterns have gone out the window. And where possible, establish approximate blocks of time on a daily basis for the following: meal times, bedtimes, and we'll talk more about bed and sleep hygiene in a bit. Having time for contact with family or family members or friends, whether in person or virtually. And maybe most important, the question of is the person scheduling decompression time or taking as full a break as possible, checking out from the routines of work and the stresses of work. And we need to essentially be able to have me time. Next. So being able to convey to the folks we're consulting with that decompression time is especially important in order to re-regulate stress reactions, but that there can be lots of things that can get in the way of that. But the idea that the person really needs a break from stress and stressful exposure becomes an essential ingredient in freeing someone up, but actually helping to give direction to the idea that time for themselves is not about being selfish. It's actually about taking care of themselves and increasing their feelings of well-being as well as effectiveness. So sample language can sound something like, particularly in these times, the idea of decompression is especially important for re-regulating. Or it's especially important to ensure that there are periods of time when you're able to take a break from understandable preoccupation with work-related activities and experiences. Part of the routine is taking a block of time when you don't have responsibilities and when this block of time will not be occupied by other things. Again, emphasizing that taking a break is actually critical to interrupting the cycle of stress reactions that one may be having both at home or at work. Next. So one of the things that we can do is, again, think about specific ways of decompressing from work in the past that you might be able to engage in again now, and to also think about the things that get in the way. So let's pause just for a moment in terms of any questions just now.
Yes, we have a question from Lucia asking if you can help identify, or like, do you help identify more or less helpful ways of checking out or coping with stress? For example, overeating, drinking.
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the things that this is one of the reasons for asking about, well, what has been useful in the past. And sometimes people will actually give responses that are very familiar, but not necessarily so helpful. So, when somebody is actually talking about, well, I'm drinking a lot, then it's also, number one, it's an opportunity to highlight that the need for drinking a lot is actually a symptom or a signal of how distressed they are. And the next part, before getting into the problems and the downside, the disadvantage of drinking as an intervention, is to first ask them how they're feeling about it. The idea that if somebody is dissatisfied with some efforts that they're making to turn the volume down, that's a much more solid platform to then consider some different options and different ways of understanding new approaches that someone actually might feel better about and may yield greater control. So the idea that we're not here to lecture people or to create an atmosphere in which we're criticizing their efforts, but rather to empathize and sympathize with what they're describing as a demonstration of how distressed they're feeling, and then to suggest that we may have some other approaches that would be more useful. And we'll get into some of those as we continue our discussion.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I was going to say we had another question that came in, but.
Right. So I think that one of the things, again, to emphasize is that, finding me time is not always easy, especially if one has parents or one's looking after others. But again, emphasizing how important this is in terms of the overall experience, and taking a break is actually part of the process of re-regulating. This can emphasize that it's not just the wish to goof off. It's actually essential to increasing better adaptations and decreasing the cycle of stress reactions. So one of the things that we wanted to talk about next, and it's very much part of the issue of establishing or reestablishing routines, is thinking about sleep hygiene. And it's maybe goes without saying, but we're going to say it anyway. And sometimes it's useful to say it with the people with whom you might be consulting, which is that, when we're not getting enough sleep, we're much more vulnerable to some of the very disruptions in feeling states, cognitive processes, and behaviors. And so the idea of being asking about and reflecting on the response in the ASDS around sleep becomes incredibly important. So obviously, if someone's not having difficulties with sleep, then one doesn't have to go into what we're about to discuss. But if they are having difficulties, it's important to be able to walk through some of the details of what people can do. Sleep routines are obviously important in helping to reset the body clock when the body clock has been disrupted. And this is not only help ensure better sleep, but in turn plays a key role in reducing vulnerabilities, stress reactions, and therefore worthy of attention. So again, one of the things that we know is that people often stay up later during stressful times in order to have decompression time. Unfortunately, this impacts the sleep cycle. So in these discussions, we were being very clear that having more sleep, first of all, reduces vulnerability. And again, the goal of the discussion about sleep hygiene or patterns, routines involved in sleep are to decrease the vulnerability to reactions. So one of the ways we get into this is by referring to the document Understanding and Coping with Reactions in a Pandemic, and being able to let people know that they'll find a resource for looking at approaches in some detail to sleep hygiene. But right now, let's review together some of the basic approaches that are recommended. Next. Again, keeping in mind that we are not trying to be prescriptive, meaning that some of the suggestions we may have are easier said than done and may be counterintuitive for many people. But when we're talking about some of the suggestions, we're talking about, just as an example, try to avoid screens and caffeine, etc. Try to avoid, meal times close to bedtime, etc. Again, this is an idea of helping someone become more aware without, again, conveying something around the idea or ignoring that some of the things we're suggesting may be easier said than done. So basics of sleep hygiene include setting regular bedtimes and waking up times. And again, this is an opportunity to talk about the importance of predictable schedules and optimal number of hours of sleep. The recommended number of hours of sleep per age for adults is 7 to 8 hours of sleep per night. But we want to recognize that this may be a hard thing to do especially when work shifts are changing. But one of the examples of helping to re-regulate is keeping naps to under 20 minutes. And per our discussion of decompression time, an hour before bedtime, you should do your best to try to disconnect, try to avoid work, try to avoid returning emails, try to avoid checking the news. Again, this is in the hour leading up to bedtime. And try to avoid talking about your day at work as a constant focus of discussions with calls with friends and family. This is not, again, trying to tell people what they shouldn't talk about, but again, to be able to ask what their contact with friends and family is like. Often there is the experience of being asked and then responding to lots of questions about what the day at work was like. And while it's understandable, both the questions and the wish to talk, what may happen is that, especially just before bedtime, this is more activating and can interfere with the capacity or the ease of getting to sleep. Avoid caffeine, nicotine, and alcohol at least 4 hours before sleep. And again, this isn't intended to be moralistic, but rather is an opportunity to share information about the timing and use of these substances with respect to sleep. Avoiding excessive use of caffeine and alcohol, that some people may not realize that with alcohol, for example, it can help them to get to sleep, but may actually contribute to disrupting the continuity of sleep. Caffeine is a stimulant. Again, people may know this, but It's a good time to remind them that caffeine is a stimulant that may interfere with sleep for up to 12 hours, avoiding large meals close to bedtime, and thinking about self-soothing activities that have been helpful to the person in the past, and being able to use relaxation techniques, which we'll review in a few minutes, in order to, again, turn the volume down on the stress reactions that can understandably interfere with getting to sleep. Next slide. The question often comes up, and for many on this call know this experience well, which is, what do you do if you wake up in the middle of the night? Lots of people are having this issue, and sleep difficulties have been one of the most common experiences that many people, whether working in hospital settings or not, are struggling with. So it can be important that people know that they're not alone with this, and to again be able to set a platform of understanding what's
Did we just lose Stephen?
Hi, Carrie. Yep, it looks like Stephen's connection might have dropped, or that he froze.
Okay. Give me 1 second. I'm going to go off camera 1 second and just see what's going on, and then I can, yeah, it looks like he's gone. 1 second.
All right, everybody. It looks like Stephen's internet dropped, and so Carrie is going offline to just connect with him via phone and troubleshoot this. All right, so just give us a couple moments.
Well, thank you for bearing with us. In our wonderful world of Zooming, sometimes disconnections can happen. So I'm going to sort of try to pick up where Stephen left off, and then we'll see if he rejoins. So I think Stephen was talking about the importance of setting regular bedtimes and wake times, talking about the importance of predictable and optimal hours of sleep. The recommended number of hours of sleep per age for adults is about 7 to 8 hours of sleep, realizing that this might be very hard to achieve, but we really want to recognize that how important it is to get as much sleep as possible. Talk to people about keeping naps to under 20 minutes, and that in terms of thinking about decompression time, thinking about an hour before bedtime, is there any way that the person could consider trying to disconnect? And I know in this day and age, I think we all know how challenging this is. So this is certainly not prescriptive, but the idea is, can an hour before bedtime, is there a way to try avoid work? Try to avoid looking at and responding to emails? Is there a way to actually try to avoid checking the news? We've talked a little bit about today about checking the news, and one element about checking the news is that as humans, we find ways to try to regain an element of control, including intellectually. And so checking the news can really be an attempt to regain sense of control and really feel better. However, we can end up triggering the very reactions that we're working to try and control. So really, I think a person thinking through why these things are being recommended, as opposed to feeling like someone's prescriptively suggesting something that just seems impossible. And then thinking about whether there's a way to try and avoid talking about your day at work when you're talking or calling family or friends. Again, really finding ways to see if you can disconnect. Another one that I think comes up also is attempting to avoid caffeine, avoid nicotine, avoid alcohol at least 4 hours before going to sleep. And we really want to make the point that this is not intended to be moralistic, but really more of an opportunity to share information about the timing of use with respect to sleep. We really want to avoid excessive use of caffeine and alcohol. Now, some people may not realize that while it can feel like, for example, alcohol may help one get to sleep, right? So many people think of alcohol as relaxant. It can actually also contribute to interrupted sleep. So it's really important to note that lots of people have a drink to fall asleep, but for people, especially as they get older, although it may help you get to sleep, it also may disrupt your sleep later in the night. And also keeping in mind that caffeine is a stimulant that can interfere with sleep for up to 12 hours. So we want to think about that. Trying to avoid large meals close to bedtime and really thinking about any kind of self-soothing activities that have been helpful to you in the past. And even thinking about using some of the relaxation techniques that we're going to be reviewing in a few minutes. So we're going to go to the next slide. Stephen, I think you've returned. So if you want to bring on your video, I'm going to turn it back over to you. And also your mic. Can you come off mute? There. Can you come on video?
I'm working on it.
Great. There you are.
Okay, sorry about that. So I want to be really clear because clearly I was talking and not broadcasting. So had you gotten to carry the waking up in the middle of the night?
Exactly where that's exactly where we are.
Excellent, thanks. So again, many people are having the issue of, and it's one of the most common experiences that folks are reporting during this time of having disruptions and interference with sleep. And one of the most troubling ones is actually for those who are able to get to sleep, but then waking up in the middle of the night. And again, one of the reasons for conveying to the folks you're talking to, consulting with, that this is common is again an opportunity to decrease the sense of isolation that people feel, particularly with regard to the frustration and helplessness that we all unfortunately know about. That experience of waking up in the middle of the night, being wide awake and exhausted, and the extent to which our minds always seem to go to the worst of our troubles, the worst of our worries that again only activate us and stimulate our bodies in a way that make it hard to go back to sleep. So I think one of the things that can be important is to recognize that there are some approaches that one size doesn't fit all, but some ways of considering, again, the reality that activated bodies are bodies that don't so readily go to sleep, and that can be one of the ways of focusing on turning the volume down first in order to return to sleep. So sample language that we might use is something along the lines of, as we know, when we wake up in the middle of the night, it's a time in spite of our exhaustion, our minds may be racing, often about worries, and in response, our bodies become activated, making it hard to return to sleep. At these times, try the following practices at waking up during the night. And again, the idea is some of the things you might experiment with. The idea that, and everybody knows this one, that you try something, it doesn't work and only adds to the frustration, which only keeps us more activated. So some of the recommendations include, and some of them may actually be counterintuitive, but try to stay in bed and simply rest. Often people get up in the middle of the night, walk around, and while that makes sense because they're feeling restless, it's also, again, keeping them and contributing to staying awake. Again, try to avoid using screens. The stimulation of the light from screens also, it's activating as it may be an effective way of diverting attention from disturbing thoughts. So if possible, try to read printed materials, and it provides an opportunity to get tired from reading without the exposure to screens. Sometimes people find it useful to listen to music in order to fall back to sleep. And again, asking what people have done in the past in order to deal with these difficulties is the first step. And again, being able to then utilize some of the relaxation techniques that we're going to begin reviewing in a few moments can be helpful in, again, addressing the physiologic or somatic activation that can be a first step to getting back into a place of being able to drift back to sleep. Next. It's important to remember that if insomnia or other sleep disruptions are persistent and they're not, and the individual's not getting enough sleep after a period of time, that it's important to be able to point them in the right direction. So sample language might be, if you continue to experience difficulties in getting a sufficient amount of sleep due to difficulties falling asleep or staying asleep or early awakening for most nights for more than 2 weeks, consult your healthcare provider to discuss further evaluation and treatment options that might be most appropriate for your use.
So Stephen, I think we'll go straight to coping strategies. There was one question that was relevant before I go to coping strategies which maybe you could answer, which is from Janet Wise-Thomas, that says, if a person stated that they were considering taking melatonin, would you encourage them to speak with their doctor about it?
Yeah, I think it's not untypical that, lots of folks know about some over-the-counter remedies. I think it's important that we don't know the full, medical history, et cetera. And I think helping people and making the specific suggestion that they can reach out to their primary healthcare providers is the best way to go.
Right. So we can go to next slide, please. Perfect. Thank you. So after reviewing the basics of daily routine with everyone you're going to be working with, and then if it's relevant, sleep hygiene. Next, we're going to focus on some additional coping strategies. And again, you're going to be selecting the coping strategies that are most prevalent, that's most relevant to the most problematic, most frequent, the symptoms and reactions that are impacting the individual the most. But one of the ways you're going to introduce coping strategies, we have some sample language here. So you might think about saying something like, now that we've reviewed some of the basic principles around daily routines, again, in sleep, if it's relevant to the individual, we're going to focus on some additional coping strategies. But we want to remember that when our minds lock on to disturbing or upsetting thoughts, our bodies really react in ways that have described as been feeling anxious, including increased heart rate, changes in breathing, muscle tension, jittery feelings in our body, et cetera. And so sometimes, without being immediately aware of the cause, we can have these feelings in our body, and that can initiate really disturbing thoughts. And it can become a bit of a vicious cycle that increases our feelings of not being in control. And so that there are some strategies that can help to interrupt this cycle and turn down the volume of these stress reactions. So if you can go to the next slide. And I want to pause for a moment because I know that there have been a couple questions that have been posted about unique situations, about, what if someone that you're working with, what if the patient you're working with has someone, a long distance relative who's really stressed, or, someone who, used to be able to go to the gym and connect and have social connectedness and maybe have some release, now during the pandemic has to stay at home and doesn't like it. I think what's really important here is that all of this can be related to the unique individual's unique experiences, because you're focusing on assessing what are their unique reactions and symptoms, and then what are the unique coping strategies that match those reactions and symptoms to actually help regain a sense of control, interrupt the cycle, and bring the volume down on their stress reactions. So I wanted to make sure that we have a context for how we can apply everything that Steve and I are talking about today. And I also wanted to sort of throw out there that Stephen and I have both been working in the field of trauma and child trauma and adult trauma for the last 30 years. We really, all of this came out of our work in both applying the evidence-based model that we've actually developed for kids impacted by traumatic, potentially traumatic events, and working with the caregivers, the adults as part of that, but also when we've been responding to disasters such as our response to September 11th, school shootings. We were one of the primary responders in the Sandy Hook shooting, et cetera. So all of these ideas came out of those experiences, and as you can see, can be applied across multiple kinds of experiences for individuals. Stephen, did you want to add anything to that before I go on to coping strategies?
Sorry, my unmuting is, anyway, no, I think the focus is, you know, we're actually trying to, aiming at increasing people's self-observing capacity and focusing on the phenomena that been helping facilitate better articulation of personal experience.
Exactly. So you're really thinking about what are some of the reactions the person is having. And so as a reminder, your goal is to focus in on the symptoms that were endorsed in that acute stress disorder scale that are most frequent or most impacting the person the most. And then we're going to introduce and review coping strategies that will be most effective in helping to decrease the symptoms and reactions. And I just want to reiterate, all of the materials that we're talking about, the PowerPoint slides that we have today, the acute stress disorder scales, brief outlines for how to conduct this model, but also we're going to send you links to resources that can be helpful. We'll be sending that out to you as well. So if you go to the next slide, one of the best ways to interrupt both the physical and somatic experience of our stress reaction is focused breathing. And on this slide, we've really tried to give you some language, some suggested language, how you might introduce it to a person. And again, this would be very useful for a person's physical or somatic experiences, sometimes can be useful in the context of intrusive thoughts, big feelings of emotion, fear, anxiety, etc. So some introductory language could be, so I'm going to talk with you now about something called focused breathing. And it may be something that the person has heard of before or experienced before, but this may be a different way for them to be thinking about it, because we're not only talking about the what, focused breathing, we're talking about the why, how it can be useful for the person. So that one of the ways of really turning the volume down on some of the physical and somatic stress reactions, as well as some of the affective reactions, is that we often refer to the feeling of being anxious or nervous or wound up. And one of the best ways is to first identify or put words to the details of the feelings that you're having. So first I want to ask you a few questions about some of the physical reactions of stress that you may be having. So you might ask the person about whether they feel their heart is beating very fast, whether they feel their breathing is less relaxed. We're looking for that shallow breathing type of thing. Whether they're feeling more antsy or more jittery, whether they have any headaches, and whether they have any stomach aches or stomach discomfort. So in addition to identifying somatic symptoms, posing these really specific, detailed questions really helps to better equip and support the individual's increased self-observing capacity. Again, the more they can increase that self-observing capacity and be aware of the reactions they're having, the more they will be successful in using coping strategies to turn the volume down on those reactions. So next slide, please. So again, here's some sample language of how to explain the why focused breathing can be helpful, not just saying go do it, right? The focused breathing can actually help interrupt the body's natural response or alarm system when we feel frightened or overwhelmed, and can really help introduce our body's chemistry that help us return to a calm state. So focused breathing can be very helpful when someone is experiencing physical or somatic reactions like shallow breathing, feeling revved up, or when their heart is really pounding, or big emotional reactions like anxiety or fear that can really help put the brakes on and calm the body down. The next slide, please. So the next sample language that you're going to see on this slide and the next is really just meant to be some sample language that you might consider in teaching focused breathing. That's presented on this slide and the next. And so I really want to reiterate that all of you may have your own way of teaching focused breathing. We just wanted to share a way that we like to do it so that you could take a look at it. For the purposes of this training, we're actually going to try out focused breathing together using the sample language as a guide. So I'm going to invite you to participate in some focused breathing with me and Stephen. So the first thing I'd like all of you participating in this training to do, first things first, is to find a spot where you can really feel comfortable. And then really just get in a relaxed, comfortable position with both feet on the floor and really just feel the chair underneath you and perhaps push your heels slightly into the floor. Now your eyes can be open or you can simply lower your gaze. Your eyes can be closed. And the idea is that we're going to breathe in through our nose and then hold it, and then breathe out slowly through your mouth. And so what I'd like you all to do is really picture a wave of air going in through your nose and filling all the way down into your lungs. And then picturing that wave of air flowing back out through your mouth. So first, just breathing normally, I'd like everybody to just take in one breath, inhaling and exhaling slowly. Now, if you just place one hand on your chest and one hand on your abdomen, just below your navel. So the hand on your chest ideally will remain still. If it's moving a lot, that means that we might be experiencing sort of shallow breathing or quick breathing. The hand on your abdomen will move out as your abdomen expands with that wave of air. So we really want to be paying attention to what's really moving here. And so focused breathing is important because what we want to do now is focus on breathing in slowly through your nose. And we're going to say to the count of 3, feeling your abdomen expand under your hand. And then you'll hold it for the count of 2. And then you'll exhale slowly through your mouth to the count of 5. And then we'll pause before taking another breath in. So we want you to pay attention to your breathing. As you're paying attention to your breathing, you might notice that your mind may wander, distracted by other thoughts, by other sensations. And of course, don't worry, that's what happens. Just notice if or when it's happening and gently try and bring your attention back to your breath and that wave of air. So let's try to do it together now. So get in your comfortable position, your hand on your chest and on your abdomen, and we're going to have you breathe in and out. So I'll have you breathe in through your nose and hold it and out. And pause. Breathe in through your nose. Hold it and out. One more time. Breathe in through your nose and hold it and out. Pause. So ideally, you'd repeat this several times. And when you have time, you can practice this for longer periods. But reminding a person that it's important to practice focused breathing a couple of times a day so that when you use it, when you're more stressed, it'll be more effective. So just waiting to use it when you feel stressed makes it much more difficult for it to be useful and for it to be, effective. So I think what we'll do here at this moment is to maybe check in with folks about questions before we take our next break. Actually, wait, hold on a second. Yes, I guess we would take our next break. Does that sound right, Stephen, or should we go into guided imagery?
I think we could go into guided imagery.
Okay, we'll go into guided imagery, and then we'll take a break for pausing, for questions, and also giving people a 5-minute break. All right. So guided imagery, let's talk about guided imagery a little bit. So if the individual has endorsed, when you were talking to them in the acute stress disorder scale, about the experience of intrusive, repetitive, upsetting, disturbing thoughts or images, which is incredibly common reaction for folks impacted by very distressing or distressful or stressful things, guided imagery can be a useful strategy to address this symptom. So on this slide, we have some introductory language, sample language, if you can look at to introduce guided imagery to an individual. Again, introducing it and telling the why behind it, why it can be useful to a person so that it actually will be more effective to them. So given what we've been talking about regarding the cycle of stress reactions, and given what you know and have been describing yourself about your own experience, the more worrisome the thoughts, the easier it is for us to get stuck on them, and we may even feel trapped and unable to escape from the thoughts themselves and from uncomfortable physical stress that we feel in our minds and bodies as a result. So guided imagery is one of those techniques that can really help us interrupt that experience. Next slide. So the next 3 slides present a way that you could consider teaching guided imagery. Again, we realize that some of you all may have your own techniques for how you do guided imagery or teach guided imagery. I think we wanted to just give you an example about how we like to teach it that also explains and really the why, but it really gets to what we're trying to do here, which is focus in on symptoms that have been very problematic for the individual and with the clear purpose of, here are some reactions here, so how we're going to bring them down. So just as we just did with focused breathing, we're going to now use some sample language. You're going to see sample language in your slides that demonstrate how an approach to guided imagery, but here we're going to together, not only we're going to demonstrate it, but we're going to experience it together. Now, one note before we sort of experience guided imagery together is that having the individual imagine a place where they feel most comfortable, most safe, most at peace is important. And again, for some individuals, they don't have a place that feels fully safe, but you're having them come up with a place in their mind where they feel most comfortable, most safe, most at peace. For some people, it is a very clear place in their reality. And some folks, it's a place in their imagination. One way that I've really taught guided imagery is to have the person picture this place in their minds and then have them do what I like to call walking around the 5 senses. What do you see in this place? What do you hear? What do you smell? What do you taste? And what do you touch? And so they'll walk through each of the 5 senses one at a time, taking the time to articulate out loud the many details of their experience of this place in their mind, 1 sense at a time. Details matter because the more details they have, the more it's going to be effective in pushing away the upsetting or distressing unwanted thoughts. So ideally, you would actually practice this with the individual during your session and talk to them about how they would want to practice it each day so that when they actually are feeling particularly high levels of distress or the symptoms that you've honed in on, they know how to use it and when to use it. So guided imagery can really be used to re-regulate at different moments in the day or in the night. The individual could take a brief break using guided imagery and go to their sort of chosen place during short breaks, during work or during their work day. Or they could take longer guided imagery breaks when they want or need to decompress at home or when going to bed and trying to go to sleep. So we're going to practice this together now. And while we want in individual sessions to actually ask the individual person to pick their own setting or place for this coping strategy, for the purpose of this training, since we are a very large group, we're going to focus on the example of a scene at the beach as we practice this together. So again, as we practice this together, I'd like for you all to just get in a very comfortable position, where you're sitting or standing, with both of your feet resting on the floor. If it's comfortable for you, you can lower your gaze or shut your eyes if it feels comfortable. And just for a few moments, allow yourself to take several nice, long, deep breaths. And just take a long, deep breath in, and then hold it briefly, and then breathe out. And as you keep breathing, just notice the cool air filling your lungs and the warm sort of air, soothing air going out, and just let your thoughts float away as you bring your attention to your breathing, both in and out. You might mentally scan your body if you notice if you're holding any tension in your muscles. And if you are, just gently let all that tension melt away with every breath that you're breathing in and out. Bring your attention to that breathing in and out. And just let yourself feel more comfortable sitting where you are. Now I'd like to invite you in your mind to imagine yourself in just a beautiful, inviting beach. And just notice in your mind, in terms of what you see in this place, notice how the bright white sand stretches down the shoreline as far as you can see. And now notice the color of your sky. Picture the sky in your mind. What color is your sky? And doing this with an individual, you would be asking sort of prompting questions to help them uncover some of these details. So what color is your sky in your mind? Does it have clouds? Maybe yes, maybe no. What else do you see around you? Perhaps picture your ocean in your mind. What color is your ocean? Are there waves? Or is your ocean calm? What else do you see in your place? Now focus on the sounds you hear. What do you hear in your place? Maybe you hear the sound of the ocean waves crashing on the beach, or maybe the sound of a seagull's cries, calling out to the wind, or maybe the dinging of a buoy. What sounds do you hear? And now I'm going to ask you to focus on the smells in your place. What do you smell? Maybe it's the salty smell of the sea air. Maybe it's the smell of different suntan lotions. Maybe it's the smell of food cooking at a nearby food stand. What do you smell in your place? And now think about the details of what you feel. What do you feel at your beach? Maybe it's the warmth of the sun on your face, or perhaps a slight cool breeze on your back. And now maybe notice the sand at your beach. Maybe the texture of the sand between your toes. Is your sand warm or is it cool? And as you rub the sand lightly between your toes, just feel a soothing sensation of relaxation gently melting through your entire body. Now picture yourself in a comfortable position in this place. Maybe you're sitting or lying on a towel at the beach in this place. Just settle in. And now just taking a long, deep breath in, and then holding it, and then breathing out. And then just feel even more relaxed and comfortable resting where you are. And then just taking another long, deep breath in, and holding it, and breathing out. And just a few minutes more, just let yourself enjoy the sights and the sounds and the smells of this beautiful day on the beach. And when you feel ready, you can bring your attention back to our virtual room together, still letting yourself feel peaceful and comfortable sitting where you are. And then when working with the individual, you want to remind them that after they've practiced this with some technique, they're going to be able to use this at varying lengths of time, depending on their schedule and circumstances. And I just want to make a note that each of these categories, what do you see, hear, smell, taste, touch, there's a reason for this, that this is an organizing function that can be quite powerful to really help get a greater sense of control and greater calm. Right? So the person is sort of functionally interrupting what they're focusing on, for example, intrusive thoughts or physical reactions. So when we introduce it, it really helps them to recognize when they're having the unpleasant thoughts. There's that increasing the self-observing capacity. So it helps them recognize when they're having unpleasant thoughts or somatic reactions, and provides them with an opportunity to take a break. So it's really important to say why it is you're suggesting this coping strategy. So for example, if they're getting stuck on a thought and if they notice activation. Okay. So I think what we'll do at this time is to pause and take our 5-minute break so that we can finish up going through the acute stress intervention after the break. So we'll see you in 5 minutes. Thank you all.
Hello?
I think we have about just a couple more seconds before people come back. All right. And as we just get started, could you advance to the next slide? Perfect, thank you. You should feel free to start at any point.
Ready?
Yep.
Okay. So we wanted to focus briefly on another approach to thinking about unhelpful thoughts. So there are two categories of unhelpful thoughts that are often useful to really help people to think about. And those are self-critical thoughts, and then attempts to anticipate the future. And these are really not untypical when people are feeling most distressed. So the self-critical thoughts often, involve dwelling on regrets about things that have happened. And often, we think about the shoulda, coulda, wouldas. And for many of the hospital staff that we've been talking with, one of the not untypical themes is thinking about a patient who may have died and thinking about what they as providers could have done differently in order to reverse the unfortunate outcome. Dwelling on things that are in fact out of control, and in fantasy trying to reassert control is both understandable and in some ways normal, but not nice and come at a high cost. So the idea of thinking about this area and also thinking too far ahead, and often in terms of imagining the worst, the what ifs, and the idea of trying to think ahead also makes sense in trying to attain some degree of mastery, but it's problematic if the direction of one's attempt to gain mastery actually increases levels of stress reactions that only perpetuate this cycle of feeling out of control, not only of the real external world, but also of one's reactions to it. So, some of the things I'm about to say are obvious, and one wants to think about how to deliver these things in a gentle and sensitive way. But it's important to remember that the past can't change, and that the experience of attempting to reverse the reality of what one wished hadn't happened can be both understandable, but again, come at a high cost to ourselves. And so the idea of trying to address these, next slide, it can be helpful to remind people and to gently remind an individual that it's not uncommon that when we feel out of control of upsetting experiences, we may later replay them in ways that are unrealistic. And again, that the fact is that reality can't be changed, but that we may pay a high price in our efforts, in our thoughts. So I think one of the things that we can think about, next slide, is the most important thing. First step is to help people to recognize when the thoughts are actually happening and what the impact is on us, what the impact is on the individual. And some of the ways of, again, sample language that we might use is something along the lines of, most people assume that feelings come from inside of us of their own accord, and we have no control over what the feelings we have or when we feel them. However, this isn't accurate. Most of the time we have feelings in response to the thoughts we have in that moment. They can be so automatic and familiar that we're not even pausing long enough to question them, in spite of the fact that they perpetuate distressing feelings. And to then add, it's not uncommon that when we feel out of control of upsetting, distressing experiences, we may later replay them in our minds in ways that are not consistent with the facts. The most important fact to remember is that the past reality can't be changed, whether we like it or not. Next. Again, the reason for this sample language is an effort to increase an individual's ability to observe what's happening in themselves. And so one of the things that we can do to help challenge these is, again, to remind people, and just using the sample language on the slide. So we want to recognize that these self-critical thoughts are happening. And then when you're experiencing the self-critical thoughts, you can ask yourself the following questions. Am I 100% sure that what I'm thinking is true or accurate to the facts? Is the thought that I'm having right now helpful to me? Is there any other way that I could look at this repetitive self-critical thought? For example, I was doing what I should have been doing, but what I was able to do may not have been a match for the illness that I was trying to treat. Or if a friend told me that they were having this self-critical thought, what would I say to them? Sometimes this question is most useful. It's an opportunity for individuals to evaluate themselves via the displacement of considering how they might think of someone else who is suffering the same kind of unhelpful thoughts. Next. In thinking about how to review the individuals who's having the unhelpful thought of thinking too far ahead or imagining the worst, the what ifs, we can again convey to the individual we're talking that the understanding of thinking too far ahead is both understandable, but increases some of the stress reactions that we're trying to help them find ways of interrupting. Again, trying to help them to appreciate that what they may be doing in these thoughts of leaping ahead is normal, but that the problem is that the cost may be very high, especially if what one is imagining of the future is another opportunity to activate our stress reactions, our stress responses. The sample language we might use is, as we've discussed, when real circumstances aren't under our control, our minds can sometimes go in the direction of creating scenarios of what could or might play out in the future, in spite of our understandable wish to be able to anticipate what will come next. When our thinking goes in the direction of worst case scenarios, these thoughts will likely increase, not decrease, our levels of distress. So the idea of recognizing that we want to feel we can predict, feel in control, but that sometimes that's not matched with reality is a way in to then move in the direction of what we would encourage people to consider. So for example, I would encourage you to actively be aware of when your thinking is going in the direction of a future that currently is impossible to know with any certainty. Similarly, I would suggest that when you actively attempt to focus instead on what is immediately knowable in the next day, the coming days, and possibly the next week, you're staying grounded in what you can know. And in doing that, you're also interrupting and hitting the pause button on trying to think too far in advance. Next, Carrie.
So One other relaxation technique that is simple and for some a very effective way of interrupting that cycle of stress reactions is progressive muscle relaxation, which is also very often referred to as PMR. So we have some sample language here on this slide for introducing progressive muscle relaxation. So again, you really want to speak to not only suggesting a coping strategy, you want to really make sure you're linking it and connecting it to a very specific reaction the person is struggling with, and making sure that you talk about how and why this is going to be helpful to them and turning the volume down of their reactions. Again, we're helping them focus on their reactions and their experience of their reactions and symptoms. So to introduce progressive muscle relaxation, something that one might say might be, in addition to focused breathing and guided imagery, some people have really found that progressive muscle relaxation can be a useful technique in helping to control stress and anxiety, to relieve insomnia, to reduce symptoms of certain types of chronic pain. And so progressive muscle relaxation is based on the simple practice of tensing or tightening one muscle group at a time, followed by a relaxation phase sort of with release of the tension. So progressive muscle relaxation can be learned by nearly anyone and really requires only a few minutes a day to practice. So in general, the individual tenses and relaxes the muscle groups one at a time in a particular specific order, generally beginning with the lower extremities practice, and then sort of moving up, and getting to the face. So moving up from the lower extremities to the abdomen, to the chest, and then getting to the face. And so this technique can really be practiced either sitting down or lying down, depending on where they are in their day or evening. Ideally practicing it with comfortable clothing on, in a quiet place with minimal distractions. So the more you can practice it in that way, the more you can use it in times of also more stress or discomfort. So we really are going to make sure that people are going to have access to all the materials connected to this training, including links to a resource that we have developed and written together with our team called Understanding and Coping with Reactions in a Pandemic, which actually includes a link to a progressive muscle relaxation instructions in case that would be helpful to folks. So I think we'll move on to the next slide.
So as many of you know, there's been a great deal of talk about how important remaining socially connected is in times of higher levels of stress. And, this is a well-established protective factor in times of stress and in post-traumatic reactions as well. But there's some considerations that we need to take into account. One of the things that we think about is that, and we can talk with folks that with whom we're consulting, is something along the lines of, while remaining connected to people with whom we feel close is very important, is an important way of maintaining our emotional well-being. After a long day at work, phone calls and contact with family and friends can sometimes feel like an exhausting burden in and of itself. And this is important to then remind folks that taking a break is very important to interrupting the cycle of stress reactions and one's own personal health and well-being. So finding a balance between social connection and me time it really requires including a consideration of the balance between, your own wishes and the wishes of others with whom you're connecting. Next. So, and this is something that we've been hearing a lot from, and many of you may have been experiencing your own version of this personally, but what we've been saying to folks in consultations, folks who are working in the hospital, is that, in addition to wanting to be in touch with others, one can also feel obligated to be responsive and to reassure and take care of family and friends who are concerned about you. When people want to talk to you about how you're doing and want to hear about your work, consider the following. Let them know directly that you need a break from thinking or talking about work and stressful topics. Let them know that in your efforts to take a break, it would be most helpful to talk about things not related to work. For example, about shared interests, books, movies, TV shows, activities, etc. We want to clarify that our goal here is not to prescribe how individuals talk and connect with people in their lives, but we want to help them to observe not only what is helpful to them, but what is also not helpful. And this can be enormously important in helping people to focus on that question. And another important point is we're all vulnerable to getting locked onto the topic of the pandemic. And that sometimes talking to someone about what's upsetting to us can be helpful. And if an individual finds it is helpful to talk about what they're feeling, what they're thinking about with regard to the pandemic, that's great. But if the individual you're consulting with and asking them is a good way of finding out, if they get off the phone and they're feeling even more exhausted than they were before, you can help them become more aware of that, help them to think about what they can do in recognizing the impact of current modes of connecting and communicating. Many of us know this feeling. It can also often feel like almost a compulsive drive to keep talking about the things that are most upsetting. And it is an attempt for us to wrap our minds about what we're hearing and seeing and experiencing. But sometimes, again, this can be more activating than calming. So it's important to remember that although friends and loved ones may want to talk to someone about, in their efforts to try to be helpful, it's also important to remind the people with whom we're consulting that it's okay and actually appropriate and necessary to set parameters if the topics and the needs of others are actually increasing the stress reactions that they're struggling with, that the individual who you're consulting with is experiencing more of, and therefore the topics of conversation are not helpful. So, central notion is in our consultations, we're asking folks, what's helpful, what's not helpful? Is it hard to tell people that you need a break? Is there concern that by asking, you'll be disclosing that you're having a hard time? But your goal is to help the individual with whom you're consulting to become more aware of what's going on for them, which then puts them in a better position to take action to decrease the level of distress and the cycle of stress reactions wherever they can. So what we're going to do is we're coming to the end. We wanted to make sure that we had plenty of time for discussion, so bear with us, and we're going to just walk through what happens as we come to the end of this first consultation session. So the idea is that we want to set it up that we're going to follow up, and we want to let the individual we're talking know that we're coming to the end of the session. We're going to be wrapping up, and that we want to explicitly talk about reviewing next steps. We do this because, again, at every step, we want to help the individual be able to predict and anticipate what's coming next, what the next session may look like. And we also don't want to feel boxed in or feel that there's a failure if the coping strategies that you've discussed in this first section didn't work. And so as we move into the wrap up, the sample language that you'll see goes something like, we've come to the end of the time we have for today. And as we discussed at the beginning of the meeting, we'll want to schedule a time for a follow-up appointment. And again, for the purpose of predictability, we're going to review what we're going to do in that next session. So say to the individual we're consulting with, in the next appointment, we'll review how you've been doing in general with regard to the areas of concern we talked about today. We're going to talk about whether the coping strategies we've discussed were helpful or not, any new areas of concern that you've noticed since the meeting we've had today, and possibly practicing or tweaking the coping strategies we've reviewed to make them as effective as possible in addressing the areas of concerns that you've told me about, and determine together any need for additional support beyond this brief intervention. So you then schedule an appointment in a week to review levels of stress reactions endorsed, and also know that should the individual continue to have high levels of experience, indicate the option they don't have to wait for a week, and indicate your availability for contact earlier than 1 week if that seems to be indicated. And then next slide. In the follow-up session, again, you're reviewing with the individual what you're going to be doing that day, and very much along the lines of what we just reviewed. And again, the sample languages, I want to start with just a brief reminder that we'll be reviewing various areas of your experience in order to consider additional coping strategies, etc. And then talking about, let's talk in general about how you've been doing since our last call. And then it's an opportunity to reintroduce the ASDS. Let's walk through the ASD again so that we can compare where things are at with regard to your stress reactions. We'll then be able to look at what reactions have remained the same, have increased or decreased, and what reactions, if any, are new. At this point, we go back because we've asked the general question, but again, for the original reasons, we're using the ASDS to help individuals articulate the specifics of their experience, which again adds to their ability to increase their capacity for self-observation with regard to the details of their experience. And then next slide. We're now going to review the areas of challenges we identified last week and discuss what strategies you found most useful. And then again, let's review the following: routines of daily life, sleep if indicated, physical reactions, troubling thoughts, mood changes, etc. Next. And then we're going to now let's talk about the ways we might consider changing or tweaking the coping strategies and discuss if there are also a need for new coping strategies. And this is really important because for people who are already struggling with their feelings of agency and competence, the idea that they may try a coping strategy and it, quote, didn't work, close quote, we want to assure them that we're in this together to figure out that certain strategies may not be as useful to them, and that then again affords an opportunity to work together and to think together about what might be more useful. In other words, what we have to say is not the gospel and not the only possibility of sources of relief. Again, one of the things that one can focus on in thinking about coping strategies is helping people better identify and see whether they can articulate the timing of when symptomatic reactions are most prominent. Again, by helping them to identify what might be triggers for certain stressful reactions, again, is an opportunity to help them gain a greater degree of predictability rather than feeling blindsided every time they're experiencing a stress reaction. Again, the second session and possibly a third session could be an opportunity to practice some of the coping strategies. Again, being able to review with them the timing of when they're having reactions, can be an opportunity to zero in on when they can make some alterations. So for example, the idea of talking about routines and social connectedness, being able to ask if they noticed what their feelings were like after a call or during a call can be another platform to think about making alterations in the nature of the contact they're having, just as an example. This is also an opportunity of being able to review and learn more about what tools and techniques the individual has used to deal with stressful situations in the past. And again, to think about what are the strengths that they assess in themselves that they can best tap into that one might not have had an opportunity to get into in the first session in as much detail. So lastly, it's an opportunity to discuss options for next steps. For some people, they request and the decision is made to have, one or two additional sessions to essentially continue a look at and support of the self-observing capacities and strategies that you've already been working on. But if the individual continues to be high and this can also be an opportunity for helping them to think about a referral for a more extensive evaluation and possible longer term treatment options. And there are few caveats to keep in mind that are especially important. That none of our stress reactions happen in a vacuum, and that many of the experiences that people may be having currently are an exacerbation of pre-existing vulnerabilities and struggles that sometimes this kind of consultation for some can be the first opportunity or an opportunity to remind them that there is work to be done that is not just specific to the increased distress associated with the pandemic and other current external dangers and threats they may be experiencing. So, Carrie, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to this before we open it up for questions and comments and discussion.
No, thank you, Stephen. I'm seeing some of the comments in the chat box. It sounds like perhaps this presentation, this approach, the acute stress intervention, may be something that people are seeing as something that might be useful in their daily practice. That again, remembering that regardless of what the cause is that's impacting someone, what we're looking for is honing in on controlling the things they can control. They may not be able to control what's happening in the world, in their immediate world or the world around them that's causing the stress reactions, but what we can do is help them hone in on putting words to what their experience is of their reactions and helping to mobilize and motivate them to actually find ways to develop coping strategies that are specific to their reactions that turn the volume down. So I'm pleased that people are finding this to be helpful and useful. Again, do want to reiterate all of the materials related to this training will be made available. I know they have been, but we will make sure that they're available to everyone, since I know that question is coming up quite a bit as well. So the last thing I would add is just to hearing that the idea is that you'd have one main session with this person. You absolutely would be able to cover this in a 50-minute session. You'd be focusing in on this, and we've given you the outline, educating folks, using the acute stress scale to help them identify specific reactions and symptoms that are impacting them the most and having they're most stressful, and then introducing concept of how to turn down the volume by talking about daily routines, addressing sleep. Someone asked the question about how you do this when you've got a working single parent who has to take care of children. This is a huge challenge, and trying to carve out me time, as Stephen was talking about, is important. But how do we help them carve out a little time to hone in on the reactions they're having, to turn the volume down and reassert that sense of control? So we could take a look a little bit, perhaps, Tiffany, at some of the questions in the Q&A box.
Yep, definitely. We do have a few that are open. And so from Lauren, we have, when a client is suffering from insomnia, the fatigue makes everything else so difficult, including motivation for self-care. Then you add in limiting duration of naps. How else can we address fatigue and motivation?
Well, I mean, again, I think being able to learn about the details, not only of what the disruptions are, but what were the typical patterns and routines of sleep prior to the experience of and the impact of the pandemic. And so being able to review what routines have been disrupted is a wonderful starting point for thinking about how to help someone get back to that. Getting into the details actually can be enormously helpful in terms of what is it, what is the nature of the disruption. So if someone, for example, is talking about how they can't get to sleep, asking specifically about what they're noticing in their bodies. And often people will say, I just feel too revved up. And as soon as someone's talking about, revved up and the details of increased heart rate and muscle tension and restlessness, etc., this is a wonderful opportunity to again talk about some of the strategies that can turn the volume down on some of the physiologic responses of dysregulation. Similarly, and often these go hand in hand, which is someone can say, the lights go out and my mind doesn't go out with them. And I am just thinking nonstop about the worst fantasies and thoughts that and no wonder I can't go to sleep. And this then is another opportunity for them to recognize both the patterns and understandable reasons why that's interfering with sleep, and then to think about some of the techniques that Carrie was demonstrating and helping us walk through, as well as helping individuals to identify and think about other times when they have struggled with difficulties with sleep and what has been useful in the past. Again, too often, especially in times when everything is feeling up in the air, the simple notion of routines and having a regular target bedtime, a regular target wake-up time is often overlooked, and helping people to unpack the details of what's getting in the way can be the basis for figuring out where to intervene with what kinds of alterations in their patterns of going to bed and trying to sleep through the night.
Thank you, Stephen. And one thing I just wanted to add, because I saw a couple of comments in the chat box, but also in the Q&A box, someone mentioning exercise, as something that could be very useful for turning down the volume of these reactions. Absolutely, we want to be clear. One of the things that one can do is actually to explore with the individual you're talking about, once you've honed in on the most problematic reactions they're having, to actually perhaps talk to them about, is there something that they have already tried that is useful that they can actually re-engage with? Again, we were just sort of going over some coping strategies that have been particularly helpful, but I think that, again, making sure that you remember that you want to tap into some of the techniques that you may already have, or actually techniques that that individual has used in the past that's been helpful for them uniquely.
And Carrie, Carrie and Stephen, anything that you guys just added in regards to, like Carrie, you touched on this a bit, but you touched on it briefly a bit with Jeanette's questions about young children. What suggestions can you provide for single parents, fathers and mothers and or mothers who have young children / childcare responsibilities after they get off of their shift at work that contribute and impact their sleep? So to that specific question, would there be anything additional or specific that you guys would add for these parents and for these workers?
I think I want to say one thing, and then there's one other question I want to make sure that we get to. Stephen, I don't know if you can see the Q&A box. But I think that one thing we can also do is send out as an additional piece of material that goes with this package of this training is a document that describes multiple resources we've developed and links to those resources, meaning reading materials, including one that we developed for parents specifically who are supporting children during a pandemic who are experiencing their own reactions. So that is something that we've actually developed specifically for parents as the audience. And so we can make sure we get that out to folks.
Oh, that would be great, yes.
So Tiffany, do you want to stay on that question? Should I move to one other one that I know we only have a few minutes, but I want to make sure that we acknowledge it?
Yes, if there's a question specifically standing out to you, let's go to that one next. One is it?
Stephen, I'm going to read it, and maybe Stephen, you might be able to respond to it because I think it's very important that we don't miss this question. The question in the Q&A from Deborah Panic, whoops, it just moved, said, how would you recommend acknowledging and addressing the increased stressors in today's society beyond the pandemic, with the police brutality, the social unrest, the racial injustice in our streets and our lives and in the news? How would you, so that's the question, how would you recommend acknowledging and addressing the increased stressors in today's society beyond the pandemic?
Yeah, I think that, I think it's absolutely incredibly important to recognize that we are not just talking about the impact of the pandemic, and that we are at a critical point, all of us are in this country, in reflecting on some additional sources of what should be enormous amounts of shared distress. I think the most important way of thinking about this is, where do our distressed reactions interfere actually with our sense of control of ourselves? And so if one is so distressed about what's going on in the external world around injustice, if one is so distressed that one can't actually make a plan for getting active and becoming involved and putting one's concerns into productive engagement, that's again both an understandable area of symptomatic reaction, but not a helpful one. And so I think that the ability to be able to observe oneself is easier said than done. You know, we talk about it a lot, but when our minds and bodies are in some ways deprived of our best coping capacities, it actually can immobilize our abilities to take positive action in response to our concerns. So yes, absolutely, the idea that the world is less ordered is something that can have an enormous impact, and what we want to be able to do is to take control where we can. And that has implications for how available we are to engage in areas of action that actually speak to our values and our aspirations, whether it's in the broader social and political world, or whether it's with regard to working with others and being available to the friends and family members and people about whom we care the most.
All right, thank you guys both. That was definitely a necessary and relevant question, especially given everything that's happening right now in this unprecedented time that's just become further stressful and impactful in both just like the lives of our colleagues and our clients. We have a couple more minutes left, and a question from one of our, an anonymous attendee was regarding going back to the focused breathing exercises. How would you alter this focused breathing exercise for someone with trauma who may initially have difficulty doing body work or mindfulness exercises such as that?
I think that my very short response would be that one of the first places is that it can often be enormously helpful to ask someone and to help someone articulate what it is about even the suggestion of such a strategy, because that can actually help to deepen your own understanding as the provider, but also help, again, provide an opportunity for that individual to articulate in more detail what it is, what are their versions, their experience of distress. And I think so before trying to push something, it's an opportunity to help someone think more about why even the suggestion is creating some discomfort. And for some, it can even, I've heard people say that it's hard for them to even catch their breath. And in those cases, it's an opportunity to actually be very clear about them being able to follow you in doing the exercise, but equally an opportunity to talk about what it is that might be stirred up that's making it difficult to find ways of calming themselves.
I think I'd add, because I know that we need to sort of wrap up for the day. I want to sort of speak both on behalf of myself and Stephen, just to say how appreciative we are that people came to this presentation. We hope it's been useful to you. Really to stress that, again, when folks are struggling with reactions to stressful situations, and I know there was a comment that it feels like we've been hit by one thing and yet another, that our goal is to both help individuals, but also look into ourselves and to see how we may be impacted by the very thing that we're trying to support folks with and help folks with who are having their own reactions. And that sometimes the reactions can get in the way of our being able to move forward and be able to respond to very stressful things that are happening out in the world, sometimes on an individual level, one-on-one with someone, but also what they may be impacting the entire community or the world. And so using these principles ourselves to raise our observational capacity, you know, when we're having reactions, so we can turn the volume down, so we can be even more useful and helpful to the individuals we work with, and even the community that we are working to support, can be a valuable thing.
And I would just, the last thing I would add is that if nothing else, we hope that this has been an opportunity for all of us to remember that we are all impacted by what's going on in the world in which we live. Mm-hmm. And if nothing else, we hope that this was an opportunity for all of us to remind each other that we are not alone, and that the experiences with which we hope we can help others deal with are ones that require recognition that we too are impacted and that we don't have to be alone in our experiences either. So thank you all very much.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Carrie and Stephen. This was such a relevant and important and necessary webinar.